Chapter 23. Brandi has a lot to think about. Brandi's mouth went dry as she thought about Zach naked. She had no doubt he'd be an expert in bed. She refused to think about why he'd be an expert in bed because that would make her sad. She would just be one of many women that Zach had had sex with. A shiver went through her. This was for her father, right? Queen and country, wasn't that what people joked about? She felt dirty and she hadn't even done anything yet. She was attracted to Zach, so that wouldn't be the problem. No, her concern was that she'd begun to like Zach. He was kind and sweet and she enjoyed his company. He knew she'd been sent to spy on him, but she was beginning to feel some loyalty to him. Her father who had raised her should come first. The fact that he couldn't tell her who he owed money to should be secondary, but it bothered her. She didn't like that he was keeping that a secret. If she knew more, she could help him better without spending nights in Zach's bed. She'd asked for the no-sex clause in the contract that called to her from her briefcase. What would her excuse be for taking it out? Zach wasn't stupid. If she didn't sign that page, he would notice. Nor could she talk to his lawyer about it without Zach knowing. Her father had unknowingly put her in a tough spot. Then again, she hadn't signed the contract yet. She could seduce Zach and still be okay. If she kept putting off signing the contract, he might forget about it. Wishful thinking on her part for sure. She started her car and pointed in the direction of the penthouse, still not sure what she should do. Maybe if she told her father about the contract, they could have brainstormed a way out of it. That wouldn't change the fact that her father was relying on her to bring down Zach to buy his company. The debts of her father still hung over her head no matter if she signed the contract or not. Darn him. My father's given me no choice. She pulled into the parking garage, still not sure what to do. She had to decide even if her father hadn't given her a deadline. She rubbed her neck. Seducing Zach was the only way. He might wonder at the sudden change, but then again, she'd thrown herself at him. Now she was going to do it sober instead of tipsy. With her plan in beta form, she climbed out of her car. Zach's driver waited there for her because she'd sent him a text. "Miss Marsing," he said. "David, thank you for coming back for me." If she was to seduce Zach, then it would have to start on their ride home. She'd never seduced a man before. Usually, she held the power because they wanted her. She was in this business arrangement with Zach, so everything was different. How did one seduce a man? She was out of her depth for sure. "My pleasure, ma'am," he said as he held the door for her. "Am I more demanding than Mr. Wilder?" "Not at all." Brandi climbed into the back seat. She wished she could talk to Fred. "David, I have a private call. Do you mind if I close the screen?" "Go ahead, ma'am." She pushed the button then called Fred. "Did I just see you?" he asked, laughing. "You have a minute to talk?" she asked. "Always, Brandi. My father shared something with me today and I'm sure you know what's going on too, and I'm not going to ask you to betray his confidence." "Okay. Why I need help with this is because of his financial situation." "Go ahead, Brandi." "I closed my office door. I have to seduce a man and I don't know how." The silence could have been cut with a knife. "Brandi, are you serious?" "Yes, I'm afraid I am. I've never done anything like that." "Are you sure you want to?" "I don't, but I don't see another way to help my dad get out of his debts." "You don't have to do it, Brandi. There must be another way." "My father is convinced that there isn't. How do I seduce a man?" "I'm not sure I'm willing to give you this advice. Don't do it. You'll feel bad in the end." He was right, but she was going to ignore that. "I'll do what I need to do to get my father out of trouble." "You don't think it's odd that a father would ask a daughter to do that?" Fred asked. Brandi brushed away the suggestion that it was wrong of her father to ask that. "He's desperate, Fred." "I know." Fred cleared his throat. "This isn't something I can help you with, Brandi. I'm sorry. I won't be a party to this." She admired his principles, but now she was no closer to knowing what she had to do to get Zach Wilder in bed. "Fine, Fred. Thanks anyway." She disconnected before she could vent her frustration on him. "We're here," David said. "Thanks, David." She entered the elevator and looked down at what she wore. All of her outfits were conservative, but she could start with one weapon. She'd been told more than once that she had a nice set of breasts, so she undid one more button on her blouse. It would show her cleavage to someone taller than her. Someone like Zach who towered over her. She arrived at her desk. "Zach wants to see you," Kendra said. Brandi nodded and knocked on his door. "Come in." He looked up and motioned for her to close the door. She sat wondering what he needed right now. She leaned down to scratch her ankle so that Zach would get a good view. His gaze flicked downward then up to her face. He cleared his throat. You told me that you had female things to do. I assumed it was a doctor's appointment or buying tampons. She opened her mouth to speak, but Zach put up his hand. Don't bother. I know you went to see your father. You had me followed? I have eyes everywhere, Brandi. I have to protect what is mine. I'm not yours, she said, then realized that getting angry at him wouldn't help her seduce him. For the time being you are. I told you not to contact your father, Brandi. I showed him the ring. That was all. Zach studied her. Yeah, I don't believe that. Well, that's what I was doing. He is my father. I'm sure I'll find out what went on, so it's your choice to lie to me or not. I guess you'll have to trust me. Zach snorted. Yeah, that I don't do, but we have a full afternoon, so let's get going. Are you working late tonight? She asked, an idea popping into her head. She could cook for him. If the way to a man's heart was through his stomach, maybe she could forge a path to other parts too. We'll be out of here together around 6 most likely. Then I want to cook you dinner. Zach eyed her but didn't say anything for a minute. Fine. I haven't made reservations anywhere yet. She rose. I need to use the ladies' room, then I'll be ready to leave. He nodded and waved her out of his office. She let out a breath when she reached the bathroom. The first step had been completed, and she'd been rewarded because he checked out her cleavage. Today her touch would linger on him a little longer than usual, then tonight would be dinner. She looked at herself in the mirror and pulled at her bun. She shook out her hair and left the bathroom armed for battle. Chapter 24. Distrusting Brandi. Zach packed up what he needed for their afternoon appointments, then looked up when Brandi entered his office. He noticed earlier that she was showing more cleavage. She was up to something, and Brandi wasn't nearly as conniving as she thought she was being. Made him think that she wasn't going to be every good spy either. He shouldn't underestimate her, but he wasn't optimistic that even if he were a dirty businessman, he doubted she'd find anything in his records. Damn Marsing for sending his daughter to do a job she was unprepared for. Now she was clearly trying another tack, and he wasn't sure it was going to work either. She hadn't signed the contract, and that was troubling to him since she'd been so eager when they'd written it out. Something had changed since she spoke to her father. Fred had called to tell him she was there but hadn't been able to discern their conversation. Fred had left a message on his phone more recently, but Zach chose to get back to him later. He actually had work to accomplish this afternoon. Brandi had let her hair out of her bun, and it hung in ringlets around her face. She looked even younger with it down. What she didn't know was that many women, including models and actresses, had thrown themselves at him. They tried to get pregnant or lied about a pregnancy to get him to marry them. He had the discipline of a monk. Even if Brandi waltzed in here naked, he wouldn't do anything about it. He had to admit she was sexy with her hair down, and he'd had more than one fantasy about pulling that bun loose and taking her on the desk. That didn't mean she had any power over him. Not at all. He chose to ignore her current appearance. We have 3 appointments this afternoon, and then we can go home. I need to stop at a grocery store. I can have something delivered to the penthouse, he said as he rose from his desk. I don't know what I want. What's your favorite meal? She asked. He searched for something that most people didn't make. He wasn't going to make this easy on her. Fried chicken. She didn't balk. She didn't even react. The Marsing household had a cook, he knew that. Had Brandi ever cooked anything in her life? Okay. She pulled out her phone, no doubt looking up a recipe. He wiped the smirk off his face before she looked back at him. Shall we go? I'm ready, she said. I'll text you a list of what I need, so you can have it delivered. He changed his mind. He hadn't been in a grocery store in years. Doing a domestic task with Brandi sounded like a fun way to end the day. We can stop on our way home. David won't mind. She nodded. We're revisiting that house? Yes. The owner is out of town, and he asked me to do another walkthrough to see if everything has been done. Seems like something you would delegate. I don't delegate much, Brandi. Besides, the owner is a friend. Got it. They parked on the street, and Brandi admired the house once again. The brick facade was complete on the front, and the green shutters had been hung. Why did the shutters take so long? Building materials shortage. We're having trouble getting things manufactured. The owner has had to make changes, or he would be waiting too long for this place to be built. She nodded. Houses are going up so fast these days. Maybe it's good that it slows down. No, that means housing prices will keep going up, making homeownership tougher for the little guy. He'd seen it happen more than once. The bubble would burst. Those who haven't prepared for it will suffer. And what happens to people like you when the bubble bursts? They climbed out of the car and Zach stopped to survey the house. I'm always prepared. I'm only as good or successful as my last deal. If you get too cocky, well, they might often fall very hard. He'd been there and he wouldn't make that mistake again. He'd lived on canned beans and peanut butter sandwiches for 3 months until he got back on his feet. It had been right after leaving Marsing's employ. He'd struck out on his own at a bad time, but had been arrogant enough to think he could be successful anyway. He'd sworn that would never happen again. How exactly do you manage that? She asked. That made him wonder if these questions had something to do with her meeting with her father. Had she found out about his debts? Things were beginning to come together in his mind about the change in Brandi's behavior. He wouldn't press her, but he would find out eventually what exactly was going on with her. I stay as debt-free as possible. I also have money in the bank professionally and personally. I have multiple projects in multiple stages and I do all types of real estate. You make it sound easy. Zach shrugged. I've missed out on deals that might have made me money, but I wasn't willing to borrow the amount of money I needed to get involved. It's a personal thing. You have such a reputation as a shark and risk taker. It isn't warranted. Oh, I'll take risks, but then I weigh the ramifications carefully before I do. He unlocked the front door and they stepped into the 2-story foyer. Zach looked around. The chandelier hasn't been installed. Brandi pulled out her tablet and made a note. Zach was enjoying her company on these walkthroughs. She had a quick mind and it felt as if he were mentoring her, which her father should have done. What exactly had she been doing at her father's company all of these years? Not his problem, but it concerned him. He was beginning to like Brandi and not just as a colleague. So noted, she said. She pointed to the bottom step. Looks like a piece of the carpeting is coming up. I told them it had been installed too soon. It should be one of the last things you do, he said, a frown creasing his face. I still have the number for the company who did it. Send Kendra an email, he said. She'll call them. Actually, I'd like to take care of this. So far I've been a sidekick and I want to be able to take some action. Zach studied her. She was eager and her gaze didn't leave his. Okay, go ahead. He put out his hand. Give me the tablet and I'll make notes while you're making that call. A part of him was proud that she was showing initiative. She handed him the tablet. He kept one ear on her phone conversation as he walked around the house, making notes. When she was done, she found him in the master bath. They'd been here before and the place had suddenly been too small for both of them. He squelched those feelings, attempting to convince himself that he was a professional. Her curls danced invitingly near her lips. All taken care of? They'll be here tomorrow afternoon to fix it. He smiled at her. Good job. She stood a little straighter after that. Had her father never praised her? She was a smart, beautiful woman and she'd make someone a great partner someday. Not him. He wasn't looking for a partner either professionally or personally. He handed her the table. I've marked what's not done and who we have to contact about it. Send Kendra an email, and then we can hit the grocery store before returning to the office. Why don't you take your truck home? She asked. Because I like to get work done on my way, and with David driving I can do that. She nodded. The grocery store was packed with men and women in business attire, all most likely buying dinner ingredients. This was probably why he had things delivered normally. This was nuts. I can go in and you can stay in the truck, Brandi said. For some reason he wanted to do this with her. No, I can handle it. She smiled. When was the last time you were in a grocery store? He couldn't remember. It's been years. Lead on. Chapter 25, The Dinner Seduction. Brandi and Zach entered the fray of the afterwork supermarket crowd. He looked around as if he'd never seen anything like it. She had a recipe on her phone and she gathered the ingredients while Zach pushed the cart. Does this happen every day? He asked. Yes. You've never been? No. I have food delivered or sometimes I employ a personal chef. For someone so compassionate, you are out of touch with the regular person, she said, then realized that wouldn't advance her goal of seducing him. She wasn't good at this. For a moment she wondered if she should bother, then she remembered her father's debts. No, she had to do this. It's more a matter of time. I'm focused on my business, not everyday things, he said. Understood. Zach didn't seem to take what she'd said as an insult, so she dropped the subject. She looked at her list. Chicken. Buy the big pack of parts, he said. Brandi turned to him. What? I thought you didn't come to grocery stores. He shrugged. I wasn't always this rich. She laughed as she dropped the large pack of chicken parts into the cart. How could Zach seem as much at home in a grocery store as he did at a high-priced gala? The man was a chameleon. Maybe that was his advantage in business, Brandi thought. He could adapt to any situation. I never asked if you had a cast iron pan, she said. He shrugged. I don't cook that much, so I don't have any idea. I better find one. We can make another stop, Brandi, if your heart is set on this meal. We'll have to, just in case you don't have one, she said. She was going to mess this up. Things like this took planning, and she just jumped at the idea with no forethought. She should probably be flirting with him or something. Could she be more out of her depth? Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. She could do this for her father. Do you like to cook, Brandi? Only if I'm cooking for someone else, she said. That was the truth. Cooking for herself was boring. Do you cook for someone else very often? She picked up items for a salad as she pondered what his question might mean. No. I'm surprised. Why? Because you're a beautiful and smart woman, Brandi. I think you would have many men at your beck and call. She swallowed. That's not the case. Then my gender doesn't know what a good thing is. They got in line at the checkout and she didn't know what else to say. Ended up Zach was flirting with her. We could use self-checkout. Zach shook his head. If the stores get you to use automation, then they can justify firing the cashiers. She'd never looked at it that way. Well, then we'll make sure people keep their jobs then. Zach packed the groceries in the back seat of the truck. He and David put them in the trunk of the car for the trip home. The woman at the kitchen store was undressing Zach with her eyes. Brandi wanted to snap her fingers in front of her face to get her attention. Zach didn't take her bait. I think Brandi here needs your help. I'm not the one cooking. The woman frowned, then turned to Brandi. What are you cooking? I'm frying chicken. Then buy a fryer, she said. The recipe I have calls for a cast iron skillet. You can do that, but a fryer is better. Honey, if that's better, then I can buy that for you, Zach said. The woman looked from Brandi then to Zach as if she was realizing for the first time that they might be a couple. Brandi wanted to grin at her in triumph, but since it was all fake, she couldn't take it as a victory. The woman wore heels and was dressed perfectly for her body. This was the type of woman Zach would go for. Not Brandi, who sighed, wondering once again if this mission should be aborted. Zach bought the fryer and then they headed home. Brandi shooed him out of the kitchen. I'll call you when it's done. Okay, let me know if you need help. She shook her head and he left. She found an apron and put it on. I can do this. This was when she wished she'd had her mother around. The cook that her father had on staff had taught her many things, and Brandi could make fancy dishes, but fried chicken had been far too pedestrian for her father's tastes. He didn't eat out much, but he liked fine dining within his own home. Brandi puttered about the kitchen, finding everything she needed. While the chicken was frying, she set 2 places at the breakfast bar. The penthouse didn't have a dining room, so this would have to do. She found candles to her surprise and put them out by the placemats. His housekeeper kept him stocked for entertaining and a brief moment. She wondered if anyone else had seduced Zach in his own home. She couldn't think like that. She was Brandi Marsing, smart and capable, and Zach had said she was beautiful. With the food done and plated, Brandi found Zach in his office. He'd taken off his tie and rolled up his sleeves. His arms were sexy, looking as if they'd been carved by a sculptor. She ogled him for a moment, drinking in the sight of him and knowing she'd see him naked tonight. Her mouth went dry. Are you going to stare all night, or are you going to feed me? She jumped at his voice. Dinner's ready. He rose. I'm starved. Sorry to make you wait. No worries, Brandi. I'm sure it'll be delicious. He stopped in the doorway. Candles. She shrugged. Atmosphere. He settled at the breakfast bar and surveyed the plates. It smells heavenly. I'm back in my grandmother's kitchen. Your grandmother cooked you fried chicken? I'm a southern boy at heart, Brandi, he said with a twang in his voice. My mother moved us up north when I was young, so I worked on losing my accent. She sensed some pain in his statement, but she'd explore that later. You surprise me, Zach. His voice went low and sexy. There are many things you don't know about me, Brandi. Her mouth went dry and she cleared her throat to recover. I guess not. Now I'm a little nervous about you trying my fried chicken. I doubt I can make it as good as a southern grandma. He laughed, but he took a bite and his eyes fell closed. This is really good, Brandi. It's good. Try it, he said. She did, and it was pretty good. Wow. I'm not bad at this. I'm sure there are many things you're good at that you have no idea about, Brandi. She liked the sound of her name in his mouth. I don't know about that. Are you fishing for a compliment? I can oblige if you need me to. No, I'm not, Zach. He studied her, then went back to working on the food. She'd make coleslaw as a side. When she looked up next, his plate was empty. Thank you, Brandi. I would have served wine, but I wasn't sure what went with fried chicken. He laughed. That's okay. I have some work to do, but I'll clean up. If you have work, I can do it. If he left her, she'd have no way to seduce him. She put a hand on his arm. I don't mind. His gaze went to where she touched him. No, I'll do it, but I have one question for you. Sure. Go ahead. She couldn't imagine what he'd ask. Why are you suddenly trying to get me into... Chapter 26. Brandi comes clean. Zach eyed Brandi, waiting for an answer. He'd had too many clues that he was being seduced to ignore it. Something had changed since her meeting with her father, and he needed to know what. He didn't like going into a situation without knowing everything about it if he could. Brandi hadn't signed the contract, and that was troubling by itself. This attempt at seduction added another layer of concern for him. Brandi, why do you think I'm doing that? She asked, her gaze not meeting his. I'm a grown man, Brandi. I'm a billionaire and a bachelor. You think you're the first woman who has tried to get me into bed. She frowned, still not making eye contact. Was I that bad? Suddenly Zach was mortified. She'd been trying something that was out of her comfort zone, and he called her on it. He hadn't meant to be mean, but he'd had to put a stop to it. Brandi probably had her share of men wanting to be in her bed, but she probably didn't know it. Then there was the trust issue that he could understand. Did someone want you for who you were or what you had in our bank account? He reached out to her and took her hand in his. It was flattering, Brandi, but out of character. How do you know it's out of character? Because you were nervous the whole time, Zach said. And I was obvious. You have to be a little obvious to get the point across. You mad? I'm flattered, Brandi. I'm a little confused since you put in the contract that we weren't going to have sex, Zach said. Her shoulders slumped and Zach wanted to relieve her burden, but he didn't know what that was. I'm no good at this. I don't know why I thought I could do it, but I guess I was desperate, she said. Zach's heart broke for the obvious turmoil Brandi was in. Tell me what happened. What changed? I suspect it has something to do with your father. Her gaze finally rose to meet his. I'd feel disloyal telling you. I may already know. She cocked her head. I'm embarrassed now. Don't be, Brandi. As much as I have women throw themselves at me, I at least find you beautiful and sexy, but I would want you in my bed because you want to be. Not because of some scheme you've cooked up. He rose and brought the empty plates into the kitchen. I should have done dessert too. Zach laughed. Well, that would have had my pants falling off. Brandi laughed too, and it was music to Zach's ears. She wasn't being too hard on herself, and she shouldn't be. Something had happened at that meeting with her father, and Zach needed to be gentle to find out. Not even for chocolate cake? I'm not that easy, Brandi, Zach said. He filled the dishwasher with whatever would fit and began to run it, musing over how to get this information out of her. He rested his hands on the bar. You want chocolate cake? To drown my embarrassment, yes. I can run out and get one. No, Zach, you've been kind enough. Seriously, I can get anything delivered. He pulled out his phone. Say the word. She eyed him and must have decided he was serious. Okay. He opened the app and ordered a chocolate cake. Voila. Done. Thank you. After what I tried, you're being kind. I'm not a monster, Brandi. I'm figuring that out. Can I pour you some wine? He asked. One glass. He put his hands up. Not trying to get you drunk. She laughed. Would that have worked? I'm a big guy. I have a pretty high tolerance, so no. He poured them wine, then led her to the love seat that faced the windows. It had a view of the city and it calmed him. I'm sorry, Zach. It's okay, Brandi, but tell me what happened. What prompted this? She chewed her lip, then put down her wine. I saw my father, as you know. I suspected this change of behavior had something to do with all this. He's having money trouble. He told me to seduce you to get information from you. Zach saw red, but he didn't show it outwardly. How could a father tell his daughter to sleep with a man he despised? If Zach had a daughter, she wouldn't date until she was 30, let alone sleep with one of his rivals. He'd cherish her, not send her into the lion's den. Did he say those actual words? Zach hoped that Brandi had misunderstood. Those exact words. How did it make you feel? Angry. Betrayed. He won't tell me who he owes money to. I could find an alternative for him. We could work this out, but he was set on his course of action. Zach stewed in that. Kent Marsing was even more despicable than Zach had ever given him credit for. He basically pimped out his own daughter. Zach fisted his hand, then let them loose. There was no need to take his anger out on Brandi. He won't tell you who he owes? No. I don't understand it. The doorbell rang. Our chocolate cake. Zach put the box on the counter, then opened it as Brandi watched from the doorway. It smells great. He cut both of them a piece and they returned to the love seat. They ate in silence. That's good, thanks, Brandi said as she set down her plate. It did hit the spot. She studied him. Why are you being so nice about all of this? How nice is it for you to pretend that we're engaged? He asked. He wasn't blameless, but she'd pushed him to that point because of her duplicity. He had to protect his company and his livelihood, but Brandi was turning out to be far less of a threat to all that than he originally thought. She waved a hand. It actually hasn't been hard, Zach. You're a nice guy. Don't tell anyone that. I have a reputation to live up to in the building world. She laughed and he liked hearing it. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you know about my father's debts? Zach wouldn't lie to her, but he wasn't sure how much of the truth he could tell her. I do. Can you enlighten me? Do you really want to know? You may not like the answer. Tell me what you know, Zach, please. He debated for a moment but decided that if Brandi knew the truth, he could protect her better if it's to roll downhill to her. Your father owes money to the Mafia. Chapter 27. Who should she believe? Zach's words hung in the air and Brandi wasn't sure she heard him correctly. What did you say? She rose from her seat and walked away from Zach, listening to his words carefully this time. Your father owes money to the Mafia. She spun back to look at him. I don't believe you. He sighed and rubbed his eyes. Why would I lie? Because you want me to rat out my father so you can take over his company. She was seeing right through Zachary Wilder now. All those niceties and sweetness were to charm her into letting down her guard. Now she wished she'd slept with him because it would only have been sex. He would have let his guard down and she'd be triumphant. I have no need to take over your father's company. I can show you my accounting. I'm solvent and not in debt. She couldn't fathom why else he would lie to her. She knew that he and her father had had a nasty falling out. Was this his revenge for being left without a mentor? What are you thinking, Brandi? He asked. She wasn't falling for the nice guy act anymore. You're lying and I'll figure out why. Why do you think your father isn't telling you who he owes money to? You have fixes for it, but he won't let you. She wasn't going to let him cloud her judgment. She put up her hand. I need to think on all of this, Zach. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I'm not lying. It's how your father was able to get some of the projects he did get. He lost others because everyone in the building industry knows his reputation. Stop. Just stop. Kent Marsing is a better man than you'll ever be, Zach Wilder. Zach flinched, but he didn't show any other reaction to her words. I'm sorry, Brandi. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but you had to know. You were making decisions based on false information. I was not, she said and could hear the petulance in her own voice. This was not how she wanted to deal with Zach. She was not thinking clearly. The fact that he had the audacity to accuse her father of being a dirty businessman when he was one just floored her. Zach lowered his voice. You were Brandi and I couldn't watch you do it anymore. Your father is in bed with the Mafia. No. I refused to believe that. She wanted to stamp her foot as she'd done as a child, but she was a woman now. His words confused her. You're accusing my father of the exact thing you do. I have no connection to the Mafia, Brandi. I never would. In fact, I've been doing my best to counteract the bad things they've done. She didn't understand what he meant. Before she could ask, he went on. Some good people have lost their homes or businesses because of your father's dealings. She shut her eyes against his words. This couldn't be true. She refused to believe it. Her father was a good man. He'd raised her when her mother had abandoned them. There was no way he was mixed up with organized crime. No. I can show you the stories in the paper and on the internet. No. They'll be fabricated. His shoulders slumped. You can see it in your heart to believe me. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer. No, she couldn't wrap her mind around Zach being the good guy and her father being the bad guy. I've worked the last 5 years to make sure that those people got restitution for what was stolen from them. It's been awful what your father has done, Brandi. I know he's your father and you love him, but I'm telling the truth. She opened her eyes to stare at him. Was Zach delusional? Did he truly believe his lies? Maybe that was the problem. Zach was so far from the truth that he didn't know it when he saw it. That could be it. When someone told lies on a regular basis, they forgot what was the truth. It didn't absolve him of lying about her father. You're not. You can stand there and deny it all day, but I have proof. I don't keep it here. You don't have proof. I don't trust you, Zach. What have I done before now that's untrustworthy? What do I have to gain by lying to you? She couldn't figure out his angle, but she would. I don't know yet. Maybe I'm telling the truth. She refused to concede that. Remember that building on K Street? The bid your father won. She did remember that project. She thought his bid was high. She could have done it for half that cost. Yes. Despite his high bid, her father got the job. She'd been surprised but assumed that everyone else's bid on the project must have been higher. Zach rose. Stay there. He returned with a folder, handing it to her. What's this? She asked. It's my bid for that project. That project finished up last year. Why would you still have this? Because I knew it would be proof of your father's dealings. I didn't know that I'd be handing it to you. She opened the folder, remembering what her father's bid had been. The project stood out to her because she had been surprised that he ended up being awarded the contract. She scanned the proposal and saw the final number. It was lower than her father's. It was more in line with what she thought she could do. Her mouth fell open, but this wasn't proof enough. My father said he knew the person handling the bids. He knew him and he bribed him. Or the Mafia tried to bribe him, and when that didn't work, he lost his job. He had just bought a house and had a baby on the way. He found another job because he approached me with the story. Why didn't he go to the police? They threatened his child, Brandi. He couldn't. She shook her head. No, this was not the truth. She couldn't believe that her father would do something like that. This was the man who would take off his tie and play tea party with her at the end of his long day. She threw the file back at Zach. No, my father is not dirty. You are, she said before storming out of the penthouse. Chapter 28. Nowhere to go. Brandi didn't have a plan when she left the penthouse. She just knew she had to get out. She needed to be away from Zach to clear her head. If she was going to prove to Zach that her father wasn't dirty, she wanted to be sure she had her arguments lined up correctly. She couldn't do it if she was angry. Zach had angered her so easily and she didn't like it. Out on the street she looked both ways, unsure of what to do now. She didn't often stay in the city, and now that she lived here temporarily, she'd only been from work to here and to the building sites. She had no idea where she was. Dimmen. The doorman studied her. Do you need a cab, miss? She whirled to look at him. Is there a bar nearby? She thought better of it since she didn't hold her alcohol well. Never mind. A coffee shop. There's one a block down on this side of the street, he said. She looked in the direction he pointed and nodded. Thanks. She remembered seeing it on her way home in the limousine. It worked for now. She didn't need the caffeine, but something warm would work. Anything warm would work, she thought as she pushed open the door to the coffee shop. An eclectic mix of furniture was scattered in groups about the place. She eyed a plaid, wingback chair and chose that for her resting place. She approached the counter and ordered herbal tea. When she received it, she settled on the chair she'd liked and stared out the window. Rain began to leave drops on the glass, tapping out an unknown song. At least the weather reflected her thoughts. Her phone buzzed in her purse. Zach. She wasn't ready to talk to him. He'd made her furious and she needed to calm down. Tucking the phone back into her purse, she debated turning it off. That would be childish, she decided. Instead, she gazed out the window and thought about what Zach had said. Was he that arrogant that he thought she would believe him? He accused her father of exactly what he was doing himself. Then again, Zach had been nothing but sweet and kind to her. He had accepted the no-sex clause of the contract willingly while her father wanted her to sleep with Zach. She shook herself. No, Zach was the bad guy here. He was the one doing dirty business, and she had to remember that no matter how charming he was. Her ego hurt a little that he hadn't been seduced by her. Maybe that was why she'd reacted how she did to him telling her that her father was dirty. Her temper had gotten the best of her because she'd been hurt at his reaction. He hadn't fallen into bed with her. She wasn't a seducer, but how hard could it be to get a man to have sex with you? Hard if the man had principles, which she was discovering Zach had. He hadn't taken advantage of her when she was drunk either time. He'd been nothing but sweet and caring. This frosted her. They should be naked in bed and she should be closer to her quest of finding dirt on Zach. You need a refill? The barista said. No, I'm good, Brandi said, even though she hadn't had more than 2 sips of her tea. Could you please reheat it in the microwave for me? The barista smiled. Sure. She returned with the mug now steaming. Thanks. Brandi said and tried to actually drink it this time. The rain slowed as she watched the drops roll down the window. She would have to face Zach at some point. Since he slept less than she did, she couldn't just wait until he went to bed. Her phone made a noise. Brandi, come home, or at least let me know that you're okay. She stared at the screen, her thumbs poised over the keyboard, wondering if she should let him squirm. No, she is an adult. She sent a text back. I'll be back in a few. No need to wait up. Of course he would. She knew this. He didn't want her to go to bed mad at him. She was rapidly letting her temper go, and when her tea was done, she headed for the penthouse. A thought stopped her on the sidewalk. What if Zach is right? What if Zach is the good guy and her father wasn't? He'd been reluctant to tell her who he owed money to. If he did owe money to the Mafia, then he wouldn't want her to know. She shook herself. Other than asking her to sleep with Zach, her father hadn't done anything suspect. Then again, neither had Zach as far as she knew. No. Her father wouldn't send her into the lion's den for selfish reasons. She clung to that idea as the elevator took her up to the top floor. The doors opened and Zach stood there. He hadn't changed, but he'd taken off his tie. Brandi. She put up a hand as she stepped out of the elevator. I'm not ready to talk. He grimaced. I have proof. Of my father's business dealings? Yes. She sighed. I'm tired, Zach. I'm not sure I can comprehend anything right now. She didn't believe him anyway. Her father wasn't dirty, but she had doubts. The evidence he had could be fabricated. It could be made up by someone like Zach, who was her father's enemy. I'm sorry, Brandi, but I do have proof. Even you will have to admit what I show you. She shook her head, her gaze going up to his. No, Zach. Not tonight. I want to sleep. Forget that I've embarrassed myself once again. You think you've embarrassed yourself? He asked. I once again threw myself at you. You tried to seduce me by making me a lovely dinner that evoked warm memories for me, he said. It hadn't felt that way from her end. It had felt like an utter failure. Whatever was wrong with her that Zach wasn't interested in betting her would be dealt with on another day. She frowned. I'm serious, Brandi. If you were anyone else and we were in any other situation, I would have slept with you, but I have more respect for you than to make this a fling. She studied him, his gaze dark and serious. Was he telling her the truth? She didn't know anymore. Her bullshit meter was on the fritz anymore. She sighed. I'm tired, Zach, and not up for any mental games. I'm not playing a game, Brandi, he said, his voice low and sexy. I meant what I said. You're a smart woman and I wouldn't disrespect you by taking you to my bed for mindless sex. She didn't know what she should think. If Zach was telling the truth about this, was he telling the truth about her father? She waved a hand. I'm going to bed. Good night, Brandi. Sleep tight. Chapter 29, Zach's Accident. When Zach woke the next morning, he didn't know what mood Brandi would be in. He tiptoed around, not hearing her moving in her room. When it was almost time to go, he knocked on her bedroom door. Brandi. Yeah. She sounded half asleep. Was she sick? Yesterday had been an emotional day for both of them, but he hoped she would feel better about his revelations today. Can I open the door? She mumbled something and he took that for a yes. Opening the door slowly, he peeked around it. Sun filtered through the blinds onto the bed where Brandi lay. The covers were rumpled and only her head stuck out from under them. She snaked out her arm and rubbed her, yes, a yawn opening her mouth. She looked like a sleepy kitten. Her hair stuck out at odd angles and she didn't look ready for work at all. You okay? I guess I overslept, she said, no rancor in her voice. I can send the car back to get you if you'd like. She didn't rise, just looked at him. I'm taking the day off. He smiled. She didn't ask for permission. She just told him. Watching her made him wonder what it would be like to wake up next to her. He should have shoved that thought away, but instead he indulged in a little fantasy of just that. He could undress and crawl into the warm bed with her, to Hill with his net worth and his empire. Okay, I hope you feel better. Text me if there's anything I can bring home after work. She said around another yawn. He closed the door quietly, leaning his head against it for a moment. He'd wanted to clear the air and get things back on track between them this morning. That wasn't going to happen. Maybe if she slept some more she'd be in a better state of mind to see the evidence he had about her father. He didn't relish that conversation, but it was a must. He had to convince Brandi that her father was the dirty businessman and not him. If he was to take down Kent Marsing, and it was looking more and more like that was going to happen, he needed Brandi safe. She shouldn't be his concern, but her naivety had played on his sense of duty. She didn't know what her father was doing. If she did, she was a great actress. He doubted that. No, her reaction last night had been genuine. He climbed into the car waiting in the garage. David started the engine. No Miss Marsing today? No, David, she's under the weather. Can I bring her anything? No. She'll be fine. Thanks for your concern, David. She's a lovely woman. Zach chuckled. He and David talked about many things, and other than Dinny, Zach trusted David the most. She is. Not many women come along quite like her. We're engaged, remember? Zach said. Of course, sir. Can you take the long way to the office? I have a few things to think about today. Yes, sir. One thing. Brandi. Would she accept the evidence that he had against her father? Zach stared out the window as he thought about Brandi, and this predicament he found himself in. The car swerved. David. Sorry, sir. This guy is getting too close to me. If he doesn't back off, I'll have to stop. Do what you need to do. There are too many bad drivers on the road, Zach said. The long way took them a little out of the city, and they were on a country road that Zach loved. The trees made his mind calm down, and that's what he needed right now. The car swerved again, then came back in the lane. Now he's behind me. The car behind them slammed into them. Zach was jolted forward. Put on your seatbelt, sir. Zach did, and then the car rammed them again. David must have lost control as they were now heading for a tree. The car stopped suddenly, and the car that had hit them sped away. Are you okay, David? Zach said, unbuckling his seatbelt. I'm banged up, but I think the car is undrivable. Steam came out of the engine compartment as Zach climbed out of the car. His head hurt, but he didn't remember banging it. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. What's your emergency? We've been run off the road. Any injuries? Minor ones. Okay, the police and ambulance are on the way. When they arrived, the EMTs insisted that both David and Zach go to the hospital. He hadn't realized he was bleeding, but he was more concerned about David. They ended up in beds next to each other. Zach contemplated calling Brandi, but then he wondered if she'd stayed home because she knew the accident was going to happen. Zach doubted it was an accident. The driver knew what he was doing. When the police were done taking his statement, Zach found a chair by David's bed. Shouldn't you be in bed also? David said. I'm okay. Just a little headache. You look banged up. They want to keep me here overnight, but I think I am fine. Do what the doctor says and take a few days off. I can drive myself, Zach said. Zach was released from the hospital an hour later after promising he would go straight home. He used a car service and they dropped him in front of his building. The day had turned cloudy, which reflected his mood. Now he would have to confront Brandi. Did she call her father while she was out last night? Did she tell him that Zach was onto him? That was the most reasonable explanation for the accident. His head throbbed a little as he rode the elevator to his penthouse. Brandi was in the kitchen making breakfast when he walked in. You're back early, she said. He entered the kitchen and stopped. There's been an accident. She still hadn't looked at him, and she didn't seem unhappy about him being back. He studied her body language, but she didn't seem surprised by his presence. She finally turned to him and her eyes widened. Zach. What happened? A car ran us off the road. She turned off the burner she was using and stalked to him. Is David okay? Yes. He's staying overnight in the hospital, but he should be released tomorrow. Do you need ice? Aspirin? What can I do? To Zach, her reaction seemed genuine. He spent his whole career studying people. He knew when they were lying, and he could see nothing in Brandi's demeanor that indicated she wasn't surprised by his accident. He let out a breath. Maybe it would be okay to be pampered for one day. I have a headache, but they gave me something for it at the hospital. Sit. You look like you're going to fall. You hungry? He sat at the breakfast bar. I don't need any food. She nodded. Do you mind if I eat mine? Be my guest. She ate and chattered, but every time she looked at him she cringed. You need to get out of those clothes. I don't know if the dry cleaner can get blood out. Zach shifted out of his jacket. His tie was in his pocket, having taken it off to be examined. He came to a conclusion in watching Brandi. She knew nothing about the accident beforehand. Chapter 30. Brandi rethinking things. Brandi couldn't believe that someone had run Zach off the road. He'd gone to bed early because he was in pain and the pills were making him drowsy. She checked on him twice, but he was sleeping peacefully. She crawled into bed but was unable to sleep. Who could have done this to him? If Zach were dirty, then he'd have enemies. Even if he was a good man, he might have enemies, but do try to kill him? That seemed extreme. Then a thought occurred to her. What if Zach was right and her father was the dirty one? Had the attack been a warning to her or her father? They could have assumed she was in the car when she wasn't. It could have been a warning to her father? Oh, my God. Now Zach was in danger. She wanted to see the evidence he had against her father before she made any decisions. She could be reading the situation incorrectly, and she had nothing to do with it. Zach woke the next day feeling better. You look like you had trouble sleeping. I was up a few times to check on you. He put his arms out to his sides, wincing as he did. I'm still here. They stood in by the elevator, almost ready to leave for work. Can you do me a favor? Sure. Show me the evidence you have against my father? I have it at the office, he said. She nodded. Okay. David is taking a few days off. I'm driving us in during that time. You do drive. I do, Brandi. I own several cars. I just don't drive them in the city. When they reached the office, Zach told Kendra they needed a few minutes before he could meet with her. You don't look as bad as I thought you would, Kendra said. David fared much worse than I did, Zach said. Brandi settled on the chair and waited for Zach to come in. When he did, he had a folder with him. He handed it to Brandi. She perused it, and if this information was true, then her father was not a good man. I know this is coming out of the blue for you, Brandi, so take a few minutes to digest it. She looked up at him. I know more. I know all about these projects, and I didn't realize that what he told me were lies. It's not your fault, Brandi. He's your father. Why would you suspect him of anything? She thought about her father's eagerness for her to sleep with Zach. He was desperate, but that was no excuse. She sighed. It all makes sense now. The late-night phone calls. The visits to the house at odd hours. I just assumed that's what happened in the business world. Not to legitimate businessmen, Brandi. Before she could say more, Kendra interrupted them. There is someone here to see you, Zach. Who is it? Did I make an appointment this early? No. He says he's from the FBI, she said. Brandi and Zach exchanged a glance. Send him in. To Brandi he said, leave me that folder. We'll talk more after the meeting. She rose and dropped the folder on his desk. She smiled at the agent waiting in the outer office. He'll see you now. The man in a gray suit stood and nodded at her. He closed the door behind him after he entered Zach's office. Do you think it's about the accident yesterday? Kendra asked. Most likely. Seems to be too much of a coincidence not to be. Brandi pondered what she'd seen in the folder. She could add some details to what Zach had. She should probably be in there talking to the agent also. I have some appointments to move around since you two will be delayed, Kendra said. Don't let me keep you. The agent left Zach's office a half of an hour later, nodding at both women as he went by. Brandi and Kendra looked at each other. But Brandi was on her feet first. She was part of this, no doubt in her mind. She didn't want Kendra to know. Brandi, could you come in here? Brandi swallowed hard, then sat across from Zach. What happened? Needless to say, that was about the accident yesterday. They happened to have a tail on the person who hit me, and wanted to know if I had anything on your father. My father's being investigated by the feds? She asked. Zach nodded. Do you believe me now? I did before the FBI came here, Zach. I'm sure I can fill in some blanks for them. What are you suggesting? He asked. I'm suggesting that I go talk to them. I'll tell them what I know. Zach shook his head. They don't need your information to convict your father. They're trying to get bigger fish than he is. Brandi studied him. But what I know might help do that. There is no need to put yourself in danger, Brandi. You're in danger. I knew that could happen if I pursued things with Kent. I must have gotten too close to something the Mafia doesn't want me to know. Do you think it's a coincidence that it was the day after you revealed things to me? She asked. It has to be. Unless my place is bugged or you are, no one would know about our conversation. Unless you told someone. Zach eyed her. No, Zach. I went to a coffee shop and had some tea. That's all that happened. Okay. He believed her? You aren't going to question me? Brandi, I think it's in your best interest to be honest with me, and if you understand your father's dealing, then you're no threat to me. Yes, I believe you. It warmed her and maybe pissed her off a little. No threat. You could be dirty too, but I doubt that. Oh, she hadn't thought of that at all. No, I'm not dirty. I didn't think so. I think you are misguided because you didn't know all that your father was involved with. So let me talk to the feds. It's your choice, but I would advise against it. I think you are already in danger. In fact, I suspect yesterday was more about you getting hurt. They just didn't realize that you weren't in the car. I'd had that same thought. I didn't mention that to the FBI guy. You don't need any scrutiny, he said. Zach was protecting her. She didn't think she needed protection. You think they might go after me? Family is always a weakness. Brandi thought about what her father had asked her to do, and wasn't so sure she was a liability in this case. Chapter 31. They take a day off. Zach studied Brandi, and she wondered what expression she had on her face. He looked concerned. Promise me that you won't do anything rash, Brandi. She sighed. She didn't have a plan at this point, but she wasn't going to just let the men take care of things. She was a grown woman who could take care of herself. I won't. She only agreed because she hadn't thought of a plan yet. Zach's gaze remained on her. What? Brandi, I'm serious. They ran me off the road. They are in this to win it, and I don't need to worry about you also. She crossed her arms. You don't need to worry about me at all. I'm not your responsibility. I disagree. The moment you stepped into my office, you became my responsibility. You didn't mean to and you didn't know, but you are. That didn't sit well with Brandi, but she also didn't want to argue. He was kind of hot when he was being protective. Zach pushed back from his desk. I have an idea. What? She asked. Let's take the day off. Wouldn't that be the second one this week? His laugh came out throaty and sexy. I own the company. I get to do that. Who will do our inspections and such? Kendra will reschedule them for tomorrow. Besides, there's a property I want to look at. Let's go for a drive. She blinked at him, doubting that a man who had built an empire took 2 days off in a week. Okay. We'll change at home and take a drive, get some lunch. You're serious? Yes, let's do something fun, and I'll get to look at that property in the country. You aren't just trying to distract me? He flashed her a smile. I'm trying to distract me also, Brandi. She thought about Zach's motives, but she doubted that he would leave her out in the middle of nowhere. We'll have fun, Brandi. Fun? He quirked one eyebrow up. Yes, fun. You know that is. I know what that is, but I never expected you to. Your game. Where are we going? He came around the desk and leaned close to her face. Trust me. I guess I have to. He straightened. You don't have to, but I'd like you to. This was a flirty side of Zach and she liked it. She spun the engagement ring on her finger, deciding. Okay, let's go have fun. You don't sound enthusiastic. She shrugged. I guess I'm not good at surprises. He put his hand on her back and ushered her out. Kendra, cancel our appointments. We're gone for the rest of the day. Kendra nodded as if this happened every single day. Okay. Take the rest of the day off when you finish that task, Zach said. Kendra's jaw dropped. You don't have to tell me twice. An hour later, Brandi climbed into the lowest car she'd ever been in. She drove sensible cars, compacts with a trunk. Brandi couldn't see how Zach was going to wedge his sexy bulk into the vehicle. He did, and smiled at Brandi as he started up the British-made sports car. This looks like a race car, she said. This company makes race cars too, but this one is street legal. You ready? For what? We're in the city. Too much traffic to go fast, Brandi said. Not for long. 15 minutes later, Zach propelled the car onto a country road and sped up. A thrill went through Brandi. This was fun. You're smiling, Brandi. Are you enjoying yourself? Zach asked. Yes. He was right. She couldn't wipe the smile from her face. He slowed a little further down the road. The property is at the top of that hill. She looked in the direction he pointed. Are the roads paved? Yes. I wouldn't take this car on a dirt road. He turned on a road that didn't even have a yellow line, it was so narrow. Where are we? A small town outside of the city, but it's close enough to have services. I don't have to extend any gas or sewer lines. Sounds ideal. Why hasn't anyone else snatched it up? Because the owner hasn't been willing to sell, but he also hasn't put a house on it either. He's getting older and maybe amenable to selling. We'll see. Is he meeting us here? Yes. It was an appointment that I made on impulse. Doesn't happen often, but I do like to go where my instincts tell me. And they directed you here? She asked. Yes, I've been following this area for a few years. All the properties around it have been built on. Each has 5 acres. This property has 10. The road became steeper as they neared the plot. Zach parked on the grass and climbed out. Brandi looked around as she disembarked. Nice view. Yeah, that's what I like about it. She looked at him as he studied the land. There was more to this than him just asking for her opinion. He liked this place. Is this for you? He turned to her. How'd you guess? The look on your face. You're looking at this land as if it were your lover. He laughed. I'm usually not so transparent. No, you are not an open book, Zach. So tell me about this place. He held his arms out to his sides. The view was the first thing you noticed. That's what drew me here. The taxes are low. This is a community, unlike living in a city. Zachary Wilder is a homebody. You want that picket fence. Who knew? He shrugged. I won't want to be in the city forever. If I ever have kids, I don't want them to group up in the city. Kids need space. Brandi thought about her upbringing. It had been on the edge of the city. She hadn't had fields to roam through, but she hadn't missed them. Where did you grow up? She should know that about him. In the city, but I had an uncle who had a farm further out than this. My mother would send me there for a month every summer. The smile on his face told her those were good memories. Before she could comment, a truck parked behind Zach's car. A man in overalls and a large hat climbed out. Zach approached him, his hand out. Mr. Falls, glad you could meet me. The men shook hands and Mr. Falls flicked his gaze at Brandi. This is my fiancée Brandi. She's also my assistant. Nice to meet you, Mr. Falls. Zach has been showing me your property. Yes, well, Mr. Wilder has been persistent about looking at this land, Mr. Falls said. Are you ready to sell? Once again the man's gaze flicked to Brandi. She suspected that he was deciding something. He cleared his throat. Make me an offer. The smile couldn't have been bigger on Zach's face. He gave the man a number so quickly that Brandi knew he'd done his research. It was a fair price. Mr. Falls held out his hand again. You get me the paperwork and we have a deal. Nice to meet you, Brandi. He climbed into his truck and drove away. He was out of sight before Zach grabbed her hand and spun her around. She ended up against him, his face hovering over hers. If we didn't have that contract about no kissing, I would kiss you right now. His lips were inches from hers. All she had to do was stand on her tiptoes and she'd reach them. I haven't signed the contract yet. He leaned down and she met him halfway. And it was a good thing there were no trees close to them because Brandi thought they'd go up in flames. Chapter 32 Brandi's Plan. Brandi lay in bed that night reviewing the day. Other than that hot kiss, Zach had been the perfect gentleman for their day out. It had been a date, or at least it felt like a date. He hadn't kissed her again. He'd taken her on a picnic and then they drove some more in the country. It had been perfect and what they both needed. Then reality came crashing back in. She was in some kind of danger and her father had put her there. She needed to know exactly what she was dealing with here. If her father wouldn't tell her, she'd find out another way. She called Fred. Hey Brandi. Did I wake you? I didn't realize what time it was. No, it's fine. What can I do for you? I need some information that only you can give me. I'll understand if you can't. This sounds serious, Brandi. She sat up. I need to know who exactly my father owes money to. That's a tall order. I know, Fred, and I get it if you can't do it. Fred sighed. I can do it. He's put you in danger, hasn't he? Yes. Then I'll do what I can. Can you meet me tomorrow? What will you do with the information? Leave that to me. The less you know, the better. They disconnected. Brandi gave Zach an excuse for leaving the office without him, and met Fred at a diner on the outskirts of the city. He was already there when she arrived and he rose to give her a hug. She sat across from him in the booth. Brandi sipped the tea that Fred had ordered for her. He had a folder in front of him. Does my father know you're gone? He doesn't know where I am if that's what you're concerned about, Brandi. Good. What do you have for me? He slid the folder across the table. This is from the ledgers that your father doesn't show to the IRS. She opened the folder and instantly understood what kind of trouble her father was in. This looks bad. It is. He can't hold out much longer, Fred said. She nodded, closing the file. Thanks for this, Fred. She left him in the diner, the folder tucked in her briefcase. When she arrived at the office, Zach was waiting for her. Brandi, my office. He'd probably had her followed, though she hadn't noticed anyone behind her. She closed the door and flopped into the chair. Holding up her hand, she said, Before you get pissed, I was seeing a friend about something. I thought we were past subterfuge, Brandi. She dug into her briefcase and pulled out the file. I got this. His gaze flicked up to her, then down to the file. What is it? Open it. He rested his hands on the folder. What have you been up to? Look at it first, Zach. He opened it and frowned. Where did you get this? I am friendly with one of my father's accountants, she said. What exactly do you plan on doing with this? Zach asked. I'm taking it to the FBI. His gaze rocketed up to her. Do you understand how much danger this puts you in? This will expose your father's criminal activity and his relationship with the Mafia. Yes. It's that we need to put him away. It will also alert that Mafia to the fact that you have this information. It puts you firmly in their crosshairs. I thought you'd be happy. Not if you keep stepping into danger, Brandi. Have you shown this to anyone else? No. I wanted you to be the first. Obviously, I should have gone straight to the FBI. Are there any other copies? He asked. His reaction puzzled her. This could put her father in jail for a long time. The threat would be over. No. Instead, he was treating her like a child. Good. I'm going to lock this in a safe. But it will get my father off of your back. Zach frowned. It puts you further into danger. I don't like it at all, Brandi. I don't care if you don't like it. My father tried to pimp me out to take you down. Zach rubbed his eyes, then pinched the bridge of his nose. I can't let you take this to the FBI. Let me? That isn't your call. In this case it is, Brandi. I don't mean to treat you like you're helpless. You are far from that, but I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. She crossed her arms. Then explain it to me. Like I'm 5. The FBI has a strong case against your father without you giving them this information. They can take down your father and parts of the Mafia without your help. That way you don't have to testify and no one will think that you're involved. She studied him and a thought came to her. You already gave them this information. Zach sighed. Yes, I did. Her eyes widened. You have someone in my father's company. Someone feeding you information. Yes, I do. I didn't think you needed to know that. Who? I'm not telling you that, Brandi. He'll be in danger if anyone else knew about him. Brandi eyed him. Zach Wilder was even smarter than she first gave him credit for. I didn't know you could be that deceitful, Zach. He cocked his head. You didn't need to know. She waved her hand. I'm not mad, Zach. I'm in awe. He laughed. Glad you approved. I've been working on taking down your father for a few years now. Your appearance in my office just made the stakes higher. He put the folder in the safe under his desk. Now what are you doing this weekend? I don't have plans. You do now. We'll be leaving Friday morning and taking a trip. Where? What do I pack? Brandi asked. You're eager. She shrugged. Our last foray was fun. He eyed her. Yes, it was. So where are we going? We'll be at the beach. Warm weather clothing. An island? What? Throw me a bone here, Zach. He laughed. Not an island but warm weather. We'll fly back on Monday afternoon. Why are you being so secretive? What's up with this trip? Business or pleasure? Pleasure. Okay. I suspect that's rare. Yes, I guess it is. Are you going to tell me where we're going? He shifted and crossed one leg over the other. Sea Witch. That's warm and full of beaches. Yes. I suspect there is more to this. Who lives in Sea Witch? Why are we taking this trip right now? He cleared his throat. Okay. I can't hide anything from you, Brandi. We're going to see my mother. Chapter 33. Making weekend plans. As smart as Brandi was about business and real estate, she wasn't seeing the big picture when it came to her father's situation. If Kent Marsing was just a bad or dirty businessman, it would be one thing. Zach would worry less about Brandi and her crusade to bring down her father. Kent Marsing had brought in the Mafia. He'd chosen to do business with a powerful and criminal organization. That made the stakes even higher. Brandi hadn't even known what her father was doing. And Zach didn't want to treat her like a child, but she needed protection. If he could get her out of town for a bit and distract her from giving any evidence to the FBI, then she might be safe. Zach stared at her as she digested his plan to take a trip to see his mother. He'd like his mother to get a bead on Brandi anyway, since he doubted he would want to part ways with her once this was over. No, he was having definite feelings for Brandi. As much as it scared him, he wasn't one to back down because of fear. He wanted time to see where their relationship went, and he couldn't do that if she wasn't alive. Since her father seemed more interested in keeping his own business alive, the task of keeping Brandi alive fell to Zach. He gladly took it on. Meeting your mother, she said. There was no joy in her voice. If Zach was to describe the look on her face, it would be one of horror. My mother is a lovely woman. I'm sure she is, having raised a son like you, but aren't you taking the fake engagement a little far? Brandi asked. Zach shrugged. He wouldn't tell her it was for her own safety that he was getting her out of town. She'd resist and she'd be right to resist. He wasn't respecting her as a grown woman because he was far too interested in keeping her safe. She'd be safe in a gated community in Seawitch. It's just a long weekend. If anyone asked you about my mother and you hadn't met her, they would suspect something about our engagement. He rose and walked around the desk, resting his butt on the edge. It'll be okay. 3 days tops. Please. He gave her the look that he used to use on his mother when he wanted something. He didn't often need to pull it out, but he figured Brandi would fall for it. She sighed. Fine. When do we leave? Friday morning. Now let me talk to my mother and set things up. You haven't talked to her yet? I'm her only child. She'll be thrilled that I'm coming to see her and bringing a woman. I'm guessing I'm the first? Zach nodded. Yep. Now go over our schedule with Kendra. And I'll be ready to go in a few minutes. Zach dialed his phone when he was alone. Zachary. He could hear the excitement in her voice. Hello, Mom. You good? Can't I call my mother for no reason? Zach said. You rarely do. Zach laughed. But I text you weekly. Not the same, but don't stop doing it. His mother had raised him alone, and when he made his first million, he bought her a house. She'd chosen where she wanted to live, and he'd made sure it was a safe place. Before she'd moved, he would see her once a week. Now she was too far for that, but he still reached out to her regularly and spent holidays at her house. I won't. I was wondering if you're busy this weekend. I wanted to come see you. And bring my fiancé. There was silence on the other end of the line. Mom. Yes, of course. I can change whatever plans I made. Please come. We'll fly in on Friday morning. Private jet or airlines? I'll charter a private jet, of course. You need me to pick you up from the airport? She asked. No, I'll rent a car. She would want to know the details he'd known. She was still his mother, and it didn't matter how old he was or how much money he made, she would always worry about him. It warmed his heart to know that no matter what happened, there was one person in his life that always was on his side. It was the part of Brandi discovering the truth about her father that didn't sit well. She was now alone in the world. Except for Zach, but that wasn't the same thing as having a supportive parent. I just need to have food. You don't even have to cook, Mom. I can take you out. She laughed. Sure, Zach. I'm not going to cook for you and your lady. Right. It was Zach's turn to laugh. Okay. I don't want you making a fuss. I'm your mother, of course I'm going to make a fuss. Okay. Fine. Just make Brandi feel comfortable. Okay. I already think she's an impressive woman to have gotten you to ask her for marriage. Zach grimaced. His mother would be disappointed when the truth came out. He was tempted to tell her the real story. But with the Mafia breathing down his neck, he wasn't willing to risk his mother's safety. A lot of former law enforcement officers lived in her community, and his mother possessed a weapon that she knew how to use. Her name was also different from his, so no one would easily find out she was his mother. His only problem was that his pilot would have to file a flight plan. At least if he was followed or tracked, they wouldn't know exactly where he was staying. Just how much the Mafia wanted him he didn't know, but he would cover his tracks as best as he could. I better go, Mom. I have a full day. Love you, Zachary. Love you too, Mom. After making all the necessary arrangements, Zach met Brandi in the outer office. Do we have a schedule? Kendra nodded. I sent it to you after Brandi approved it. Good. Let's go. Brandi climbed into the truck, but Zach sensed something was going on. Do we really need to go see your mother? I mean, we'll have to act the whole time like we're in love. Was that such a hardship? Not for Zach. Getting to hold and touch Brandi would be a pleasure. Am I that repulsive? Brandi's eyes widened. No, that's not what I mean. Zach laughed. I'm busting your chops, Brandi. Look, it'll be fine. It just makes sense for our charade that we would go there. Okay, promise. It won't be a hardship. She frowned. You're sure? We're going to have to get our story straight, like about how we met and how you asked. No problem. We have the 2-hour flight to do that on. She nodded, but Zach didn't think she was convinced. He put a hand on her arm. Do you trust me? She didn't hesitate. Yes. Then this weekend will be fine. I promise. Chapter 34. A bumpy ride. Brandi hadn't flown on a jet in more than a year, during the last vacation she took, and she'd never flown on a private jet. The plane had 10 seats on it. Zach and Brandi were the only occupants. If she understood him correctly, Zach's company owned the plane, but he rented it out to others for use. Zach had had an emergency, and now it was Friday afternoon instead of the morning flight they'd planned. The pilot greeted them as he climbed on. We'll be ready to go in 15 minutes. Anyone need anything? No, Jeff, we're fine. Thanks. I know where everything is, Zach said. What does he have to do? Doesn't he just fly the plane? Brandi asked. He has to check that there is nothing wrong with the plane. I walked around with him once. Of course, Zach would see anything as an opportunity to learn something and not treat the pilot as just an employee. Every interaction she watched made her like him more and more. If she wasn't careful, she'd lose her heart to Zach. What are you smiling at? He asked. She shrugged, then looked out the window. Nothing. There was no need for him to know that she was beginning to have feelings for him. That he was completely different from what her father had told her he'd be. Zach didn't need to know that he was a better man than her father would ever be, and that hurt her to even think that. She still loved her father, but she didn't like him at the moment. The plane took off as scheduled and Zach took off his seatbelt. You need anything to drink? I'm fine, thanks. He rose and came back with 2 bottles of water. He handed her one. Just in case you change your mind. Thanks. How long is the flight? 2 hours. She nodded and glanced out the window. Zach had insisted she had the window seat, and she took full advantage of it, watching the clouds and the countryside go past the plane. Zach pulled out paperwork and began to read it. A few minutes later he said, Brandi, look at this please. Where can I cut some costs? She took the sheet he handed to her and perused it. The flooring. Use laminate instead of tile. Some laminates look like tile and can be just as elegant. 1 less stall in the men's room. He took the paperwork back from her and scanned it. You're right. Thanks. She smiled at him. The fact that he trusted her opinion warmed her. That was another check in the like column for Zach. His mother was probably going to be charming too. She was in deep. The plane jolted and Brandi grabbed onto Zach. Just some turbulence. It'll be fine. She looked at her hand on his arm. He absently put his hand on top of hers while his gaze stayed on what he was reading. The plane did the jump again and then a third time. Zach looked at her, his brow creased. That was more than usual. The loudspeaker clicked on. We're having some engine trouble. I'm going to try a couple of things, but we may have to land. Zach put away his paperwork, buckled his seatbelt and insisted she buckled hers too. Then took Brandi's hand in both of us. I'm sure we'll be fine. Brandi's heart sped up a little, but she didn't know if it was from the situation or Zach holding her hand. The plane rocked and rolled a little and Brandi had to admit that Zach's presence was calming. I trust this pilot implicitly. He's a good guy. The pilot came on the speaker again. We're going to have to make an emergency landing, but I've found an airfield. I don't know how smooth this will be, but I'll do my best. Zach squeezed her hand tighter. We'll be fine. Brandi nodded, unable to speak. Flying unsettled her anyway, and now to have this happen she wasn't sure she'd get on a plane ever again. The pilot ended up putting the plane down at a small airport in a tiny town. He opened the cockpit door. I'll get a mechanic here right away. Zach glanced out the window. I hope you can find one. He unbuckled his seatbelt and pulled out his phone. How long do you think we'll be here? Do I need to get us rooms? I would plan on that. I checked this plane twice and it's been in the shop for routine maintenance. I don't know what could be wrong, Jeff said. No worries. I doubt it's your fault, Zach said. He showed no anger. Zach seemed to be able to take things in stride. Brandi was frozen in her seat, glad to be on the ground. Zach rose. Let's get to the terminal and see what we can find. Brandi tried to get up, then realized her belt was still buckled. She undid and let Zach lead her off the plane. You okay? She put a hand on her chest where her heart hadn't slowed its beat yet. I will be. The terminal was one small building. The airport was surrounded by hills and Brandi didn't see much in the way of civilization. A vending machine sat just inside the door while an electric clock hummed over a counter scattered with toy planes. A disheveled man stood behind the counter, his thinning hair sticking out at odd angles, an unlit stub of a cigar hanging out of his mouth. Zach approached the desk and stuck out his hand. Hey, we had to make an emergency landing here. We need a place to stay. Any recommendations? The man removed the cigar from his mouth. Only one motel in the town. East of here. Cowtown Motel. The man handed Zach a paper with the address on it. Can we rent a car? No car rental here. Car hire? Zach asked. No, but you can borrow the airport truck. Truck? Zach asked. Brandi figured they were sleeping in the airport tonight. Yeah, we have a truck that we lend to pilots. Okay, we'll do that. Do I need to leave some kind of deposit? No, your plane being here is enough. Comes with the landing fee, he said. Zach turned to Brandi. Let me see what Jeff is up to and if he needs a ride, and we'll take this truck. The man slid a set of keys across the counter to Zach, who picked them up. It's right outside. When Brandi and Zach exited the terminal, all they saw was a rusted truck from more than 2 decades ago. Zach looked at Brandi. I guess this will be an adventure. I'll get our bags and talk to Jeff. Brandi would have leaned against the truck, but she didn't want to get any rust on her. Zach returned with their bags. Jeff's staying with the plane. Keep your eyes open for a place to have dinner. You know where we're going? I do have a cell signal, so I can use my map program, Zach said. You need help climbing in? Brandi eyed the tall truck. I think I can do it. They were on the road minutes later. They passed a diner, and Brandi suspected that might be the only restaurant in town. We could eat there. Okay, let's get settled and come back. The motel was one of those that if we're in the city, it probably rented rooms by the hour. There was only one room available, and that made Brandi sure that they'd be lulled to sleep by the sounds of other people having sex. The room was surprisingly clean and had 2 beds. Brandi let out a breath she'd been holding when she saw the second bed. Let me have the bed closest to the door, Zach said. Brandi wasn't going to argue. Shall we eat? Yeah, that diner is our only choice from searching for restaurants, Zach said. Let me text my mother and let her know we won't be there tonight. Then they were back in the hulking vehicle and on their way to